So let's begin our course with a discussion of Plato's Allegory of the Cave. I think this is one of the most famous ideas to come out of Plato in terms of ideas that are in circulation, not only within scholarship and academic circles, but also within the general and broader culture of ideas that have been infused with Plato's thinking. And I also think, for our purposes, it's a wonderful defense of higher education and really what we're doing here, the role of critical thinking, the role of um, engagement with ideas, of personal growth, of philosophy, of the humanities, of the liberal arts. And so let's really kick off our course and try to set the tone for our course with this famous idea from Plato's dialogue, The Republic. In order to get to the Republic, I think we need to reflect on its primary individual and its author. So at the center of the Republic, indeed at the center of all of Plato's dialogues, is Socrates. Socrates was a philosopher in ancient Greece. He lived 469 to 399 before the Common Era. He's often credited with the founding of Western philosophy. He and Plato together credited with founding Western philosophy. As one academic once put it, all of Western philosophy is footnotes to Plato. Socrates was not a writer himself, but we have texts about him, primarily the texts that come to us from Plato, but also another one of Socrates' students, Xenophon. And we also have texts in which Socrates is satirized, such as The Clouds, which is an ancient Greek comedy by the playwright Aristophanes. Socrates engaged in an argumentative process of asking and answering questions to stimulate critical thinking, to reveal contradictions in thinking, and to rule out propositions and positions. And if you do this sufficiently, that you've ruled out all of the flawed or contradictory or irrational thinking, it should ultimately leave you with a conclusion that is approaching the truth. Not necessarily the truth, capital T, the truth, but something that's getting closer to the truth. In all sorts of debates and dialogues and arguments, these ideas are being continually subjected to new thoughts and new individuals, and are always subject to new data, new ideas, new insights, and new research. This process, sometimes called the Socratic method, kind of goes like this. Socrates would be in a conversation with you, and you would say something, I don't know, something maybe along the lines of like, well, I support the death penalty for criminals. And Socrates would say, what speak clearly here. What is it that you are really supporting? Like, what kind of death penalty? What do you mean support? Who are criminals? What are the crimes that you think people should be subjected to? And then he would ask, what are your reasons for supporting this belief? Where does this idea of capital punishment come from? And that would kick off, a conversation back and forth. If during the course of that conversation, you said something that would appear maybe on the surface to be a contradiction to something else that you had said, Socrates would try to get you to clarify which of those positions you actually held, or to resolve the contradiction or the difference between those ideas. And if that led to the ruling out of an idea, then it would be set aside, and instead we would focus on the ideas that remain. sometimes the point of the dialogue here is that you've got the wrong belief. The belief that you hold or the opinion that you hold is irrational, right? Maybe the point here is that you should not support capital punishment. Or sometimes the goal here is to point out that the reasons you have for supporting something are actually irrational. It's not necessarily that the conclusion itself is wrong, but it's how you've reached the conclusion that represents a kind of lazy or non-scholarly or irrational form of thinking. As you can imagine, going around and quizzing and engaging with the intellectual leaders of Athens in this manner, and often proving fools of them in the process, did not make Socrates a popular guy. Sure, he had his core followers, right? People like Xenophon and Plato and other students who really kind of followed him around and tried to learn from him. He wasn't a teacher in the classic sense of like going into a classroom, but it was more along the lines of following him and learning how to reason in the same way that Socrates was able to reason. But this didn't earn him a lot of fans from the city of Athens. And in fact, Athens put him on trial in 399 BCE for being a threat to the social order. He was found guilty and he was executed. And the crimes that they charged him with were impiety, that is a lack of respect or a sufficient devotion or reverence to the gods of Athens, and for corrupting the youth. This kind of really famous idea of like putting ideas in kids' heads and indoctrinating them, right? Teaching them to think critically, to push back against the social order, and to not just accept what their elders or their leaders told them, made him something of a threat in that way. The Allegory of the Cave appears in the Republic, which is by Plato. Plato was a student of Socrates. Again, there's this sort of loose definition of the word student here. Much of what we know of Socrates is found in Plato's philosophical dialogues. Plato is credited with founding the first university in the West called the Academy. It's where we get the word academic from, in reference to the type of work that we do in colleges and universities. The Republic is a book-length dialogue in which Socrates discusses justice. In all of the dialogues, there's like a central idea that Socrates is really trying to grapple with, and is often talking to somebody who purports to be an expert in this concept. And the Republic is about justice in the sense of what would be an ideal government, right? The ideal government is the one that is of greatest justice, the one that is ruled by, well, coincidentally enough, it's ruled by philosophers, kings sort of deeply trained in philosophy, but also this sense of what is justice within the individual. How does the individual structure their minds and their hearts and their souls, orient themselves toward the concept of justice and to be just people. This is really no means exhaustive. You can't really summarize the Republic in one slide. It's a monumental text, highly influential, and sometimes greatly controversial work. Some of Plato's ideas associated with the Republic are strongly anti-democratic. There are also ideas deep inside the Republic that have to do with concerns associated with art and what would be appropriate art for the city to have, or should it have any kind of art whatsoever. We're not going to go into those here. If you're interested in that, I recommend maybe taking a philosophy course or a course on ancient literature or world literature, where maybe you could learn a little more about the key ideas inside Plato's Republic. We're just really going to focus on this one moment from the Republic. It appears in Book 7 of the Republic. And as I said, it's become known as the Allegory of the Cave. It's a famous defense of philosophy and learning, which, we in our class here, we can broadly understand this as an argument for the humanities, for the liberal arts. It's called the Allegory of the Cave, and the word allegory simply means a story that has some kind of point or some sort of moral to it. And, if you're familiar at all with the Christian Gospels, you might be familiar with the fact that Jesus often speaks in parables. These are stories that are told that aren't really about the story itself. It's more of a stand-in for a larger idea. And an allegory functions in that same way. It's like a story length metaphor. It means, it's a story that kind of stands on its own, but it also has this deeper meaning to it. In the allegory, Socrates is arguing, in my reading of the allegory for our purposes here, arguing that the point of education is to free the soul from its constraints. And this is really done through the study of philosophy and other liberal arts. Liberal in this sense is the sort of the classical definition of the word liberal. It's used, modern days in that sort of conservative liberal political paradigm, but liberal in this sense derives from the Latin word liber. It means free. It's the root word on liberty, for instance, and also library. That sense of freedom, to be a free person. It's the liberal arts are what are in contrast to the technical or the mechanical arts. So if you think about, like, at a community college like ours, there are trade courses, advanced manufacturing, engineering, there are, computer information science, technical courses, also health sciences courses. It's a technical or a mechanical kind of course that teaches you how to do something. But our college also offers courses on English and history and math and science. These are the courses that are sort of more of the mind, more concept-based courses, as opposed to practical, application of something. It would be the difference between, for instance, a phlebotomy course that teaches you how to draw blood versus a health and medical ethics course that teaches you about, would it ever be okay to, I don't know, take someone's organs after they died and donate them? Should organ donation be opt-in or opt-out, so on and so forth. So let's look at the Allegory of the Cave. This isn't the whole text of the Allegory. I've sort of selected passages to be able to read you the Allegory. This is from a translation of the Republic by G.M.A. Grube. And here's what Socrates has to say. Imagine human beings living in an underground cave-like dwelling with an entrance a long way up, which is both open to the light and as wide as the cave itself. They've been there since childhood, right? These people living in the cave, they've been there since childhood, fixed in the same place, with their necks and legs fettered, only able to see in front of them because their bonds prevent them from turning their heads around. Light is provided by a fire burning far above and behind them. Do you suppose that these prisoners see anything of themselves and one another besides the shadow that the fire casts on the wall in front of them? The prisoners would, in every way, believe the truth is nothing other than the shadows of those artifacts. So maybe you have an image of this in your mind now, this image that Socrates is talking about. Let me give you a visual representation of this. So we have our individuals who are bound on one side of the wall. They're held in chains, they can't move, they're stuck on the side of the wall. There's a fire burning, and as objects pass between the fire and the wall, these objects cast shadows on the wall. And the people who are behind the wall, they've never seen these objects in real life before, right? They've never seen this clay vase before. They've only ever seen the shadow projected on the wall. And to them, the shadow is what's real. It's all they've ever known. It's all they've ever seen. They don't know the actual object that's causing the shadow or the source of the light behind them that's flickering on the wall in front of them. So this is the situation that Socrates is asking us to imagine and to say, if you were trapped on the wall, you've never seen these objects, you've never seen the fire behind you, you've only ever seen the flickering objects on the wall in front of you, wouldn't you believe those objects were real? He says, consider then what being released from their bonds and cured of their ignorance would naturally be like. When one of them was freed and suddenly compelled to stand up, turn his head, walk, and look up toward the light, he'd be pained and dazzled and unable to see the things whose shadows he'd seen before. I suppose then he'd need time to get adjusted before he could see things in the world above, right? So what Socrates is saying is, imagine this individual who's on the wall, chained to the wall of the cave, is liberated from the bonds keeping them chained to the cave. And as they crawl out of the cave and get out into the world above, imagine how bright and painful the sun is going to be. Like if you've ever woken up in the middle of the night and gone into the bathroom and turned on the light, and it's a bright light, and the light's bouncing off of the walls and the mirror and the glass, and it's like overwhelmingly bright, and your pupils are so dilated because you've been in the dark, and it just lets all of this light in. It's incredibly overwhelming. And Socrates is saying, becoming freed from the darkness in the cave and climbing out, it would be disorienting. You wouldn't know what you were looking at. You could be looking at the actual vase that causes that shadow, but you wouldn't know that's what you were looking at. Not at first, at least. So Socrates continues, consider this too. If the man went down into the cave again and sat down in his same seat, wouldn't his eyes, coming suddenly out of the sun like that, be filled with darkness? And before his eyes had recovered, the adjustment would not be quick. While his vision was still dim, if he had to compete again with the perpetual prisoners in recognizing the shadows, wouldn't he invite ridicule? Wouldn't it be said of him that he'd returned from his upward journey with his eyesight ruined, and that it isn't worthwhile even to try to travel upward? Let's think a little bit about what Socrates is saying here, right? Liberated from the darkness and going out into the sunlight is going to change the way you see things. You can't go from the light back into the darkness quite so easily. It takes time for your eyes to adjust. And that going back into the darkness, your eyes would not be as strong as the people who are trapped in darkness. And the people who never escaped the cave would think that you were ridiculous in trying to describe the world above. Like, what do you mean that shadow on the wall is actually molded out of dirt and can hold things inside it? What are you talking about? Right? That's not real. You're ridiculous. And besides, look, you came back down here and you can't even see what we see now, right? That whole endeavor, the whole reason you did it wasn't even worthwhile. Right? Well, we could think about this allegory and the message that it has to say about the role of critical thinking and education in our world, right? The people down in the cave, they're the practitioners of conventional thinking. They're us, right? They're who we are before we've learned, before we've developed and fine-tuned the skills of critical thinking, before we've gone to school, before we've been exposed to new ideas, right? This is the way that we're just who we're all in this idea together. And then we leave the practice of conventional thinking, right? That sort of casual, unsophisticated, uncritical, widely accepted, passed down conventional thinking. This is what you should believe, and this is why. Then we go through the process of education and we emerge as somebody who's a more critical thinker, someone who sees things for the way that they are and doesn't just accept the conventional thinking. So the people chained to the wall, they're the practitioners of conventional thinking. You can see the people escaping the cave, they're in the process of education. And the person who is outside the cave and he's literally seeing the light, right? I mean, that's kind of where that metaphor is coming from, this idea of like, I see the light, I see things as they really are. This is the critical thinker. Who then is the robed characters? Who are the robed characters who are moving the objects and casting shadows for us, the practitioners of conventional thinking? I mean, these are the people who are strongly influential in setting up the thinking of other people. I'm calling them, just for the sake of convenience, the influencers, right? These are your parents. These are your family members. These are your friends. This is the government, the society that you live in, your teachers, your religious leaders, the media. These are the people who feed ideas out into the culture. And once those ideas are out in the culture, you have a choice. Are you going to interrogate the ideas and work through and test them against what you know and what others are saying? Are you going to see if the ideas are consistent? Are you going to subject the ideas to logical scrutiny? Or are you going to passively receive all the ideas given to you and accept them and continue following the line of conventional thinking, the thinking that the society wants you to do, right? And you can see, just knowing what you now know about Socrates, you can see where he fits into this, right? The influencers in this model, these are the people who are, it's the city of Athens. They're the ones who want the young people of Athens to just accept certain ideas. And Socrates comes along as an educator, a philosopher, and he starts freeing people from behind the walls, freeing them of their conventional thinking, or challenging the conventional thinking that's being broadcast or projected up onto the wall there, and is helping to create critical thinkers. You can see why this is a threat to the social order, right? The idea that this is what we believe and this is why you have to believe it, and if you think otherwise, you could be a threat to the power, to the structures of power that are protecting conventional thinking. Now, I want to make a couple of observations here about the allegory, right? I don't want you to get caught up in generalizations, but I don't want you to get caught up in a lazy dichotomy of right and wrong, right? There are a lot of issues that are a matter of fact and fantasy, right? But the point of the allegory is the pursuit of knowledge through critical thinking is superior to passive reception of other people's ideas. This doesn't mean that what the teacher does is changes your mind. I want to be really clear about that. I'm not saying that the role of education is, you believe X and I believe Y, and I'm going to show you why Y is right. What I am trying to say, though, is that the role of learning and practicing critical thinking is you may actually still believe X when all is said and done, but your reasoning skills for how you got to X will be strengthened, right? In one of Plato's other dialogues, the Symposium, there's a moment where Socrates is talking with somebody who tells him, don't you know the world's more than just right and wrong, ignorance and wisdom? And Socrates says, what are you talking about? The person says, yeah, what's in between wisdom and ignorance is believing the right thing, but for all the wrong reasons. Sloppy thinking got you there. It's just random that you happened upon the right outcome. You didn't actually do the work to get there. You just passively received something that someone else said, and it just so happens that they've got the most defensible position, but how they got to it was a matter of sloppy thinking. So I want to make sure that what you're not taking away from this is the idea that the influencers are necessarily, like, quote unquote, the bad guys or something, right? It's just that from the influencer's perspective, believing what I tell you to believe, whether it's right or whether it's wrong, believing what I tell you to believe is just easier when you just believe it and you don't question it. Now, sometimes those influencers will be peddling falsehoods, right? But other times they may not. But you won't know what is fact and fantasy except through the process of critical thinking. That's also not to say that there's no such thing as facts, right? There are facts, and we can have reasonable disagreements about issues around the fact, right? Climate change is a factual reality that the planet Earth is experiencing. We can have debates over the right approach to addressing climate change. And somebody could take the position, look, the right way to address climate change is not to do anything. The Earth will just work itself out. You could also say the right way to address climate change is an aggressive campaign of behavioral changes to mitigate the effects of climate change. One side is not necessarily factual or not, right? The factual matter is that climate change is happening. How we address it is a matter of argument and a matter of debate. But climate change is not real is a fantasy. It's not a fact. So you got to be careful what you're trying to distinguish here. This is all part of the critical thinking. Another idea deeply embedded in the allegory is that most people are really comfortable in their ignorance. and their passive inheritance of information. And people can get very hostile when that is pointed out, or when people are challenged on their beliefs. And that hostility is one of the reasons that Plato himself was actually an extreme skeptic of democracy. I'm not going to defend that view for the purposes of this discussion. In fact, we'll have plenty of time to talk about that view a little once we get to Aristotle. But Plato has this skepticism because he believes people are comfortable with ignorance and they can grow hostile when pointed out, and that he thinks this makes popular government, popular representation, or popular voting something that's a threat, and because he saw the way that Socrates was treated. Another idea, I think, deeply in the allegory here is that Socrates is reminding us that education is not always easy. It's not always comfortable. It can be unsettling. It can be disorienting, right? But if we keep reason as our lodestar, if we keep reason as the thing that we are following, it will get us there, even if we have to struggle along the way. So as I mentioned, I think it's easy, maybe way too easy, to walk away with this particular reading of the allegory with the impression that the influencers are just antagonistic and that they're purveyors of misinformation and falsehoods, right? You can't believe the media. People say that all the time, right? You can't believe the media, or you can't believe your parents, or you can't believe anything that a religious leader tells you. They're all trying to take advantage of you. They're all trying to, indoctrinate you, right? And here's the thing, that view, that like broad brush view that everybody is evil or everybody is lying to you, that's actually the opposite of critical thinking, right? I mean, the irony there is that like you're painting so broad of a brush that you're wrapping a lot of people up in something that's, honestly, it's just not true. Here's the thing. It can be true, but it's so much more complicated than that, right? We can't broadly dismiss all of these influencers, parents, family, media, religious leaders, the government, teachers. We can't broadly dismiss them all, because some people within those groups really can be thoughtful. They can be nuanced. They can be critical thinkers themselves. But some aren't, right? The world is a complex place. And that's why critical thinking itself is so important, because it's going to help us figure out who's actually a critical thinker and who's not. The world's a complex place. We cannot blindly accept everything we're told, but we also cannot be infinitely skeptical. When I say infinitely skeptical, I mean skeptical to the point where you're essentially nihilistic. Nothing's true. Nothing's real. Everything's a lie. Everything's just a matter of personal interpretation. And that, of course, is just not true. We should have healthy skepticism, but we can't be infinitely skeptical, because, that way lies madness. That way be dragons, as the old saying in medieval cartography, used to go. They didn't know what was out there, and it was scary for all of those reasons. So we can't be infinitely skeptical to the point where there's no facts, no reality, no nothing. But we also shouldn't blindly accept everything we're told. That's critical thinking's in that sweet spot between blind acceptance and infinite skepticism, right? Blind acceptance and infinite skepticism are two ends of a spectrum, and they essentially circle back around onto each other. Believing everything you're told and believing nothing you're told, and never having any beliefs because everybody's lying. Those are the same outcomes, but on opposite ends of the spectrum. We want to try to find that golden mean where we have an acceptance of the things that are reasonable and rational, and a skepticism of the things that are not. So let's end this discussion of the allegory of the cave with some characteristics of critical thinking. The word critical comes from a Greek word, kritikos. It means able to judge or to discern. So critical in this sense doesn't necessarily mean like wagging the finger, being negative, you're wrong, blah, blah, blah. It can mean that. But in this case, it just means having thinking that is discerning, having thinking that is complex, being able to judge what is reasonable from what is irrational, being able to judge what is well supported from what is not well supported, being able to distinguish fact from opinion, logic from emotion. Critical thinking is actually a notoriously difficult concept to define, but it's also one of those things that everyone says they value it, right? And so think about how strange that is. It's a continually valued idea, but it's an idea that people have a lot of trouble defining. And I think also there's a good deal of people who say they value critical thinking, but they themselves never want to be challenged. And we might question how deeply they do value critical thinking if that is the case. Here's a good definition from Daniel Willingham that I think really gets to the heart of critical thinking. Critical thinking consists of seeing both sides of an issue, being open to new evidence that disconfirms your ideas, reasoning dispassionately, demanding that claims be backed by evidence, deducing and inferring conclusions from available facts, solving problems, and so forth. I think that's a really good definition of critical thinking, right? Seeing both sides of the issue doesn't mean that you have to accept both sides of the issue, but having a sense of understanding, seeing the world complexly, being open to new evidence that disconfirms your ideas. You may think A, but if new evidence comes along that suggests actually it's B, changing your mind is not a vice. It's not a weakness, right? Being able to look at the information in front of you and to say, well, what I believe is actually proven wrong by this evidence that has come out. Perhaps that means I need to change my position. In our broader society, that's actually frequently described as a weakness. I think it's a strength. It's a remarkable strength, and it's so rare that people are willing to do it. I think that's part of what makes critical thinking such a valuable concept to teach. Reasoning dispassionately. In other words, relying more on logic than emotions. Notice I said more, not exclusively. So emotions, we can't stop our emotions from creeping in, but trying to separate ideas into logic and emotions is an important part of critical thinking. Demanding that claims be backed by evidence. And I would go a step further in saying understanding what evidence is truly valuable, is truly reliable, is another aspect of critical thinking that this class is going to cover. Deducing and inferring conclusions from available facts, right? There's this, we'll talk about deduction and induction in this course, but notice we get conclusions from facts. We don't have conclusions and then go searching for facts to justify them. We start first with the information in front of us, what is known to us now, and we draw conclusions from that information. Problem solving is another great skill of critical thinking. And Willingham gives us the wonderful and so forth at the end here that I'll be trying to fill in with more information throughout the course. Here's another really great information from Joe Lau and Jonathan Chan in an article they wrote, What is Critical Thinking? Critical thinkers understand the logical connections between ideas. They identify and they construct and they evaluate arguments. They detect inconsistencies and common mistakes in reasoning. They solve problems systematically, right? Their approach to problem solving follows a formula, and they follow each step of that formula. They don't jump around to get outcomes that they find more desirable. They identify the relevance and importance of ideas, and they reflect on the justification for their beliefs and their values. Why do I believe what I believe? What evidence do I have to support it? Is an essential skill of critical thinking. This is a list of characteristics of critical thinking. Not to belabor the point, some of these were present on the other slide, but just kind of reframing some of these ideas. So they follow the reasoning where it leads. That's a willingness to change minds based on new data and constructive criticism. You believe one thing and someone puts forward a really strong argument, it's not a weakness to change your mind. Critical thinkers don't always assume that the people who disagree with them are wrong, right? A disagreement could be two people coming at it from different places. Perhaps you're the one who's wrong, and the person who's coming at you and disagreeing with you is actually bringing a stronger argument to the table. There's not that knee-jerk assumption or this us versus them mentality where all the people who are like us are right and all the people who are like them are wrong. Critical thinkers are interested in other people and their points of view, right? They understand that even though they don't agree with somebody, that's a person. How did that person come to that view, right? They're curious. They actively listen. They seek to learn from other people before drawing a conclusion. It doesn't mean that they're going to necessarily agree, but they do follow the process. They think collaboratively. They ask good questions that advance a discussion. They don't shut down debate, but they encourage and they foster and they advance debate and discussion. They know how to separate what is a good source and a bad source of information. They know how to separate fact and opinion. They engage in clear and precise thinking, right? They always want to try to define their terms. They want to make sure that everybody's on the same page. They don't engage in slippery or vague or ambiguous thinking. They try to notice bias in thinking. They want to say, I'm going to challenge you when you seem to be showing some bias in your thinking. And that includes themselves, right? Critical thinkers are reflective on their own processes. A lot of times I'll have students come through the course and they say that they're a champion of critical thinking because they love to point out the flaws in other people, but they don't turn that reflection back on themselves. You know, it's not the role of the critical thinker to say, I'm absolutely right and everyone around me is wrong. That's the way it often seems in our society, though. Critical thinkers are logically consistent. They want to try to separate their reasons from their emotions. And as I said a couple slides ago, they do not embrace infinite skepticism or nihilism. Critical thinkers understand that there is something like reality. There are facts. We have to get as close as we can to understanding what is real and what is not, and what is most rational and what is not. There's not this kind of infinite skepticism of saying, well, nobody will ever know the answer to that. So, you know, it basically doesn't count. That's really no way to live your life. In fact, you don't live your life that way. Even if you think, you know, you don't trust anybody, you have to trust some people. Otherwise, you know, you'd be living in a bunker in the ground, not enrolled in a college course. And even then, if you were in a bunker in the ground, don't you have to have some level of trust that the person who made the bunker is at least trustworthy? Unless you made the bunker yourself, but then you had to use probably blueprints from somebody, so you had to trust. So you can see how this kind of spirals out. People who say they don't trust anybody are really often what they're really saying is they do trust people. They just use that I don't trust anybody as a way of shutting down debate so that the debate can't advance. All right. So what are the implications of the allegory? The final point that I'm going to make here, really at the heart of the allegory of the cave, then, are Socrates' two favorite questions. These will be the questions that are going to guide us for the rest of the term as we unfold our course, right? Question number one, what exactly do you mean by that? And question number two, what evidence do you have to support your claim? What do you mean when you say that, and what evidence do you have? From these two questions, we will be spiraling out lots of systems and strategies and approaches to ideas that I think are going to help you, if you keep an open mind and a willingness to explore, are going to help you become a better critical thinker. And in the end, the allegory of the cave, by the end of the course, I hope, will be a central idea that you'll be able to take forward and use in any kind of situation that calls upon clear, rational, critical thinking.